In 1980, a bullet took John Lennon from the world, but the pain for his family never really stopped. Julian grew up without a father who chose fame over him. Sean grew up without a father at all. And Yoko Ono carried the weight of that December night for more than 4 decades. Now she's 91 years old. She's retreated from the spotlight completely. Her last public appearance was years ago, and the news coming from inside her world is devastating. The Lennon family is facing something they never expected. And this time, there's no song that can fix it. John Winston Lennon came into the world on October 9, 1940, while Liverpool shook under a violent German air raid. The hospital lights flickered, sirens cried through the city, and public transport had already shut down. Julia, only 26, gave birth around 6:30 in the evening, with no family by her side, because no one could risk walking outside. Alfred, the father, was somewhere at sea working as a merchant seaman, and the city had been bombed just 2 days earlier. Houses were gone. Train sheds were gone. Docks were burning. It felt like the world was breaking apart as he arrived. Julia named him Winston to honor Winston Churchill in those dark months, because they needed hope anywhere they could find it. That wild beginning slipped into John's life like a shadow that would follow him for years. His father was wrapped in his own storms long before John was born. Alfred spent years in an orphanage after losing his own father and learned early how to survive with humor and music. But he didn't learn how to stay. He missed the birth. He missed the milestones. He drifted in and out of Liverpool while John grew older. By the time Alfred returned in January 1945, Julia had already moved on. She refused his offer to help raise John and another child. The tiny boy absorbed these absences without knowing how to name them, but they stayed buried inside him. Later, when he wrote about love and loss and fear, people could hear that wound in his music. The only thing Alfred managed to pass to him was rhythm. Everything else was distance. When John was 5, that distance stretched even further. He didn't fully understand why he was no longer living with Julia or Alfred, only that he now slept at 251 Menlove Avenue under the strict watch of his Aunt Mimi. She loved him in her own hard way and believed discipline kept a child safe. She had sharp rules and an even sharper tongue. She often told him the guitar was fine hobby, but would never feed him. Still, he stayed there most of his childhood because people worried about Julia's new relationship and her unstable home. The grown-ups made choices he didn't understand, and he tried to make sense of where he belonged. That confusion later spilled into his words, his art, and the intensity he poured into everything he created. Even so, Julia didn't vanish. She found her way back to him through secret visits and pockets of warmth. Sometimes she'd sweep in with her quick laugh and her banjo. She taught him simple chords and played songs like "Ain't That a Shame," and those moments felt like a different world. She showed him the early spark of rock and roll. She showed him joy. She showed him freedom. But she also left, again and again. John never knew when he'd see her, and that mixture of love and uncertainty pressed deep into him. Her banjo was his first true instrument. Her encouragement was the first thing that made him believe he could create something of his own. Her presence and disappearance shaped him at the same time. Then, when he was 17, everything shifted again. Julia was killed on July 15, 1958, only a short walk from Mimi's house. She had just spent time with the Smiths and was heading home when the accident happened. John's world snapped apart. He drowned himself in drinking and fighting because the anger swallowed him whole. This was the second time life had taken her away, but this time she wasn't coming back. That pain curled into his music. He wrote Julia. He wrote Mother. He wrote My Mummy's Dead. He named his first son Julian to keep her memory alive. The grief turned into something raw that stayed inside him forever. School didn't offer him comfort. Teachers at Dovedale Primary and Quarrybank High School never forgot his loud mouth or his wild temper. He cracked jokes, started fights, disrupted lessons, and pushed boundaries because something restless kept moving in him. Parents told their children to stay away from him. His school reports said he lacked effort, had a terrible attitude, and aimed for all the wrong things. The truth was, he didn't know where he fit. He came from 5 strong women and no steady home, and sometimes the only way he knew to be seen was to act out. Beneath all the noise, though, he carried a sharp wit and a mind always building something strange and new. That strange and new thing became the Daily Howl. While most students focused on assignments, John made his own satirical magazine full of cartoons and absurd stories inspired by the Goon Show. He wrote and drew at home, then brought the latest issue to school to read to his friends. The jokes were dark. The drawings were grotesque. Teachers hated it. His friends loved it. His best friend, Pete Shotton, was the first judge. If Pete laughed, John knew it worked. Years later, pieces of that humor rippled through his Beatles lyrics and his books in his own right and Spaniard in the Works. Some of those early poems even made their way into the pages of Merseybeat. It was messy, chaotic creativity, but it was unmistakably his. Even though he had talent, school stayed difficult. Dyslexia made reading and spelling hard, and he failed his O-levels at Quarrybank. He got into Liverpool College of Art only because Mimi pushed and the headmaster helped. At art school, he wore teddy boy clothes and fought the rules the same way he always had. He filled notebooks with caricatures of teachers and students. Arthur Ballard, one of his tutors, said John's notebook was the wittiest thing he had ever seen, but that wasn't enough to save him. He failed his lettering exam. He never finished his final year. He walked through school like a storm, leaving behind frustration and brilliance in equal measure. Music slowly caught him the way nothing else could. In 1956, inspired by Elvis and the skiffle craze, he formed the Quarrymen with friends from Quarrybank. The name came from a line in the school song that he thought was ridiculous. They played American rock and roll and skiffle covers, and every rehearsal became a place where John could pour out whatever lived inside him. The lineup shifted. They added guitars, a tea-chest bass, a washboard, and even a banjo. Eventually, Colin Hanton joined on drums and Rod Davis on banjo. John led the group without hesitation. The band became an outlet, a release, and a beginning. Then everything changed on July 6, 1957. The Quarrymen were performing at the Woolton Church Fete. John was 16, full of swagger and nerves. Paul McCartney, only 15, walked in with a mutual friend named Ivan Vaughn. Paul watched John play Come Go With Me, then tuned John's guitar and sang some rock and roll lyrics from memory. John noticed the calm confidence behind it. After thinking it over, he invited Paul to join. Paul's first audition happened at a scout camp in Derbyshire, and soon he became part of the band. That moment grew into the partnership that built the core of the Beatles and changed music forever. The next years were fire. From 1960 to 1962, the Beatles played more than 270 shows in Hamburg. Some nights, they performed 8 hours straight, pushing past exhaustion with amphetamines just to stay awake. They lived on almost nothing, slept wherever they could, and played rock and roll until their fingers hurt. John later said he grew up in Hamburg, not Liverpool, because the city hardened him and sharpened them all. The repetition shaped their sound. The rough clubs shaped their style. The long nights turned them into a real band. When Brian Epstein saw them at the Cavern Club in December 1961, he saw potential hidden under the chaos. He became their manager and cleaned up their image. Out went the leather jackets. In came the suits and tidy haircuts. He banned smoking and swearing on stage. Lennon didn't love the new look, but he understood it. The cleaner image helped them break into the mainstream, and soon Beatlemania swept across the world. But inside the storm of fame, John felt caged. Screaming fans drowned out the music. Reporters followed him everywhere. Epstein's polished image pressed on him until he could barely breathe. His comment about being more popular than Jesus sparked controversy and showed how tangled his relationship with fame had become. Even when millions adored him, he felt alone. His songwriting revealed truths he hid from everyone else. Help came out in 1965, but the lyrics were a real cry for help. I'm a Loser showed how lost he felt. Your Blues screamed loneliness and despair. He wrapped humor around his pain, but the honesty inside the songs made them unforgettable. Fans felt it even when he didn't explain it. The storm around John Lennon started long before anyone realized how far it would reach. It began quietly in March 1966, when he told the London Evening Standard that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus now. He said it as an observation about faith losing ground, while rock music kept growing. But the words drifted harmlessly through the UK with almost no reaction. Everything changed months later when an American teen magazine reprinted the quote in July 1966. Suddenly, the same line that felt small in England exploded across the Bible Belt. Radio stations banned Beatles songs, records were tossed into public bonfires, and the Ku Klux Klan stood outside concerts with picket signs and burning crosses. The backlash grew sharper during their 1966 US tour, bringing death threats, canceled press events, and angry crowds waiting outside arenas. Lennon apologized over and over, trying to explain that he wasn't comparing himself to Christ. But the damage was already buried too deep. The anger pushed the Beatles away from touring, closing off a part of Lennon's world and pushing him further into the studio, further into politics, and further into himself. Years later, when Mark David Chapman murdered Lennon in 1980, he claimed this quote had influenced him. Later, he denied it, but the shadow of that moment stayed. That shadow stretched into other parts of Lennon's life. His early relationships carried their own darkness. His first wife, Cynthia, remembered a night in college when he slapped her after she danced with a friend. She hit her head on pipes and walked away, but he apologized, and she returned. Their marriage moved forward under a mix of love, emotional strain, and moments of violence. Lennon admitted years later in a Playboy interview that he had been violent with partners and even strangers, including a fight with a sailor in Hamburg. May Pang, who became his girlfriend in the mid-70s, wrote that one night he tried to strangle her while drunk, and she was only saved when a friend intervened. When Lennon wrote the song Jealous Guy, many believed he was trying to face what he had done and put some of it into music. These stories sit beside his fame, like a difficult truth that never faded. His fame also brought the US government into his life when he moved there in 1971. He spoke against the Vietnam War, and that was enough for the Nixon administration to take notice. The FBI built a 300-page file on him and used a 1968 marijuana conviction in England as the reason to start deportation proceedings. In March 1972, Lennon's visa was revoked, and the government pushed to remove him. They feared he might inspire anti-war protests at the 1972 Republican National Convention. Lennon fought the case for years, exhausted and paranoid from constant surveillance. He finally won a green card in 1975, but the fear and stress left their mark. They pushed him deeper into privacy and strengthened his desire to step away from the public stage. Before that retreat, something else had already begun changing him. On November 9, 1966, he walked into the Indica Gallery in London to see Yoko Ono's solo exhibition. He showed up early because the gallery's co-owner, John Dunbar, had told him about something called a happening in a bag. Lennon thought it meant something wild and rushed over. Yoko was irritated someone was allowed in early, but the moment he entered, something pulled him toward her art. He joked that he would give her an imaginary 5 shillings and hammer an imaginary nail into her piece, playing off her hammer-a-nail installation. The room buzzed with avant-garde artists, including Roman Polanski, and the energy made everything feel alive. Lennon even took a bite out of one of her art apples, which had to be replaced before the show officially opened. That meeting kept echoing in both their lives, shaping an artistic and personal partnership that grew stronger with every year. Soon, Yoko became a constant presence in the Beatles studio. She was the only partner ever allowed inside, breaking a long-standing rule that no wives or girlfriends were permitted during sessions. Her presence began during the White Album sessions in 1968 and continued through Let It Be in 1969. Lennon insisted she sit beside him even in the control room, and she sometimes spoke for him during discussions, which frustrated Paul, George, and Ringo. George complained that Yoko didn't like the Beatles and wanted to pull John away. Ringo said her constant presence felt strange and unsettling. Paul later admitted that her being there made it hard to write with John because she was always between them. Her presence became the spark for rumors that she broke up the band, even though insiders agreed the group was already splitting under financial and creative pressure. The world made Yoko pay for that rumor. When she and Lennon became public, the media and many fans turned her into a villain. Headlines blamed her for the breakup, and people hurled racist and sexist insults at her. Paul, George, and Ringo openly criticized her in interviews, which only fueled the anger. Yoko later said this destroyed her reputation and made her a target for years. Even decades later, people repeated the same myth. Meanwhile, her own avant-garde work was pushed aside and mocked simply because she stood beside Lennon. She received hate mail and death threats. Her art was dismissed before anyone even looked at it. For many years, the hate drowned out everything else. Lennon and Yoko pushed back in their own way. They leaned deeper into art and activism, with experimental records and their bed-ins for peace in 1969. After marrying on March 20th that year, they staged the first bed-in at the Hilton Amsterdam from March 25 to March 31. They spent 12 hours a day talking to the press about peace, while sitting in bed with signs that read, "Hair Peace" and "Bed Peace." They made a 40-minute documentary called Honeymoon during their stay. Their second bed-in happened at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, where they recorded Give Peace a Chance, surrounded by guests like Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg. Critics mocked them, but the events made them symbols of the counterculture. They also released albums like Two Virgins and Unfinished Music No. 1, which shocked listeners with raw, strange sounds meant to break rules. Their artistic choices weren't safe, but they shaped conversations that still linger today. While Lennon built this new life with Yoko, his old one suffered. His decision to leave Cynthia and their son Julian created a deep wound that never fully closed. Julian was only 5 when his father left in 1968. As John's fame grew, his presence in Julian's life shrank. Years later, Julian said he couldn't understand how a man could leave his own child and then preach peace to the world. He called his father a hypocrite. Their relationship stayed strained with long periods of silence. Julian received very little from John's estate until a legal battle in 2009 changed things. The emotional damage, though, stayed. Even now, Julian talks about the pain of feeling abandoned. It became one of the saddest parts of Lennon's legacy. By the summer of 1973, cracks formed in John and Yoko's marriage, too. The failure of Lennon's 1972 album Sometime in New York City had shaken them both. Yoko was exhausted from years of blame and criticism. Their trust was fraying. Then she made a decision that surprised everyone, even John. She suggested they separate for a while. She even arranged for him to start a relationship with their assistant, May Pang. John moved out of the Dakota in August 1973 and began living with Pang. This became the start of his period known as the Lost Weekend. It lasted 18 months and was filled with wild parties, long nights, and erratic behavior. But it also brought bursts of creativity and moments of growth. Yoko kept a close hold on everything, calling regularly and telling Pang how to manage John's day-to-day life. The break was meant to help him rediscover himself without being swallowed by her shadow or the world's judgment. The chaos reached its peak at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. On March 12, 1974, Lennon and Harry Nilsson were thrown out after heckling the Smothers Brothers during their show. Lennon had been drinking brandy Alexander's and kept shouting until staff tried to calm him down. He threw punches, lost his iconic round glasses, and caused enough trouble that actress Pam Grier was kicked out simply for standing nearby. The story spread everywhere. Lennon later sent flowers and an apology letter saying they were humbled by their bad manners. That night became a symbol of how out of control he had become, and also hinted at the moment when he finally began realizing what he was doing to himself. Even during this wild stretch, something softer appeared. In January 1974, Julian visited him in Los Angeles for about a week. It was short, but it mattered. They went to Disneyland. They laughed. They shared moments that Julian remembered years later as rare bright spots. For a brief stretch, Lennon stepped away from the chaos and tried to be a present father. The visit didn't fix everything, but it gave them a memory untouched by drama. Eventually, Lennon returned to New York in early 1975 with Yoko's permission, though the wounds from infidelity, addiction, and public humiliation stayed. Their life inside the Dakota became more private and guarded. The building sat on the Upper West Side with walls thick enough to hold in everything they wanted to keep from the world. They owned multiple units that together added up to nearly 6,000 square feet. Some were homes, some storage, some studios. It became their fortress. Yoko stayed in the Dakota even after Lennon's death in December 1980. The building became the place where their love, their pain, and their art settled. It was a sanctuary and a reminder of how deeply they needed protection from the world outside. John Lennon stepped out of his car that cold night on December 8, 1980, thinking only about getting upstairs with Yoko after a long recording session. He had no idea that someone who had asked him for an autograph earlier that day was still waiting outside the Dakota, holding a copy of Double Fantasy and a storm of disturbed thoughts. Mark David Chapman, only 25, had stood there for hours with The Catcher in the Rye tucked under his arm, believing the book somehow gave meaning to what he planned to do. At 10:50 that night, as John walked toward the entrance, Chapman raised a .38 special revolver and fired 5 hollow-point bullets. 4 struck John in the back and tore through him before he could even turn. Yoko screamed. The doorman lunged, and John collapsed on the pavement as the city froze in disbelief. A police car rushed him to Roosevelt Hospital, but doctors could only confirm what everyone in that room already saw. He was gone before they even reached the emergency doors. Chapman didn't run. He stayed on the sidewalk, reading his copy of The Catcher in the Rye, as if nothing around him was real. The world woke up to news that felt impossible. Millions mourned the loss of a man who had just returned to music and seemed ready to start a new life filled with peace, family, and creation. When the shock began to settle, Yoko Ono made a choice that surprised almost everyone. She refused a public funeral. She said she could not turn her private heartbreak into a spectacle. Instead, she asked people everywhere to stop for 10 minutes of silence on December 14th at 2 p.m. And that afternoon, millions across the world paused together. Radios went quiet. Streets slowed down. Homes fell still. Yoko released a short message saying that John loved and prayed for humanity, and she hoped people would do the same for him. That silence became a moment of unity, the kind John had always tried to sing into existence. And while the world honored him, Yoko held on to the knowledge that more than 1.2 million people in the United States would go on to lose their lives to gun violence in the years after his death, a number she often mentioned in her advocacy. A few months later, the city began turning a neglected corner of Central Park into something gentle and living. They called it Strawberry Fields, named for John's song and meant as a tribute that would grow rather than stand still. Yoko pushed for a memorial built from nature instead of stone because she believed that plants and quiet paths captured John's spirit better than a statue ever could. On October 9, 1985, which would have been his 45th birthday, the memorial was officially dedicated. Fans from around the world came to see the imagined mosaic at its center. They left flowers and candles and handwritten notes. Over the years, thousands have gathered there every December to remember the way John changed their lives. Even when the mosaic started to sink in 2007, because the ground beneath it shifted, people kept coming. Bruce Kelly, the landscape architect who designed the memorial, had created something peaceful enough to carry grief and hopeful enough to feel like healing. Far across the ocean in the UK, 17-year-old Julian Lennon woke up to the news of his father's murder with a shock that cut straight through him. He had spent most of his childhood as a distant figure in John's life, a child left behind while John embraced peace campaigns, fame, and later a new family. But in the months before John's death, father and son had slowly started to speak again. They shared music. They talked more often. And during their last call, John played him the song Starting Over through the phone, saying he wanted Julian to hear it. That small moment made the news of his death even harder to carry. Julian later admitted he felt a hurricane of emotions, grief tangled with anger. He said that his father talked about peace and love to the world, but never managed to bring that same warmth home. Even with that pain, Julian always cared for his younger brother, saying he loved Sean deeply and hoped Sean would be able to carry the weight of their shared legacy. Meanwhile, inside the Dakota, where John had been killed at the entrance, 5-year-old John Lennon grew up with memories shaped by loss he could not fully understand. Every sound in that building, every fan gathered outside, every echo of his father's music became part of his childhood. Yoko protected him the best she could, giving him routine, warmth, and distance from the noise outside their door. Sean has said that recordings of his father became like pieces of time he could claim, a way to know the parent taken from him too soon. The Dakota became both a home and a memorial. Fans sometimes gathered outside to celebrate Sean's birthday, and he learned early how tightly his life was tied to his father's absence. As he grew older, he explained that leaving the Dakota would have felt stranger than staying because it was the place where their family had begun. Julian's childhood told a different story. Born on April 8, 1963, he was 5 years old when John left his mother, Cynthia, for Yoko Ono. The separation was sharp and final. Julian later said that his father could speak about peace to the world, but he never brought that peace into their home. Paul McCartney wrote "Hey Jude" for Julian as a comfort during that painful time, and the song arrived the same year as the divorce. For years, Julian felt like he grew up in the shadow of a man who belonged more to the world than to him. Decades later, he learned that John had not included him in his will, which fed the old ache of being forgotten. Even as an adult, Julian struggled to find his place in the Beatles story, often feeling like an outsider who had to fight for recognition. Sean's early life painted the opposite picture. Born on October 9, 1975, he arrived on John's 35th birthday, and John stepped away from music to raise him full-time. During those house husband years, John cooked, changed diapers, and spent nearly every day with Sean. Sean often described their bond as something warm and complete, a connection that showed how much John wanted to break the cycle of abandonment that haunted him from his own childhood. Those years deepened the contrast between the brothers and shaped the layers of emotion that would stay between them long into their adult lives. Still, over time, Julian and Sean found a way toward each other. They appeared together for Beatles tributes. They shared photos from the Dakota in December 2024. They talked often, leaned on each other, and tried to bridge the complicated legacy their father left behind. Sean called Julian his best mate. Julian said he loved Sean very much. Their closeness became a quiet answer to the wounds of the past, even as both admitted that their father's contradictions still echoed in their lives. Sean found comfort in John's music. Listening to old tapes, unreleased tracks, and quiet demos felt to him like gaining extra minutes with a father he barely knew. In 2024, he said that diving into the music helped him understand the man behind the legend. Julian felt something similar. Through the music, both sons reached for a connection that tragedy had taken away from them so early. While this unfolded, Yoko Ono slowly stepped back from public life. After living at the Dakota for more than half a century, she began appearing less often. Her last major in-person event was in 2018 at the launch of the John Lennon Educational Tour bus. After that, her presence faded into virtual messages and rare glimpses. Fans noticed she often used a wheelchair, and rumors about illness began to spread. She mentioned having an illness, but never explained what it was. Sean was often seen helping her, guiding her through crowds or pushing her chair. Some whispered about dementia, but no one confirmed anything. Age had simply caught up with her, and she chose to let the world move on without her. In 2023, she moved full-time to a 600-acre farm in Franklin, New York, a place she and John had bought back in 1978. It became her retreat, a quiet space far from the noise of the city where John died. She still owns her Dakota apartment, but the farm became her home, a place where she could drift into privacy and away from the constant memories tied to New York. Sean stayed close. He split his time between his own work and caring for his mother. In a 2025 interview, he said she had slowed down and retired, and he was focused on protecting her peace while honoring the legacy both his parents left behind. For fans, it was bittersweet to watch Yoko disappear into quiet retirement. She had once stood at the center of art, activism, and New York life. Now she lived far away from the world she had shaped, carried gently by the son she raised. Through all of this, John Lennon's legacy kept evolving, shaped by admiration, regret, and the complicated truth of his personal life. His public image as a peace advocate clashed with stories from his past. In 1962, he struck Cynthia during an argument, something he later acknowledged with deep regret in a 1970 interview where he said He had been a violent man learning to change. His infidelity was well known. His childhood trauma left scars that followed him into adulthood. And yet, those same contradictions made people debate how to remember him, as both a flawed human being and a symbol for peace. Songs like Imagine and Give Peace a Chance carried that tension. Imagine came out on October 11, 1971, and became an anthem for movements across the world. Religious groups criticized it. The Nixon administration tried to deport him, and John himself pointed out the irony that he sang about a world without possessions while living in comfort. Yoko was finally credited as co-writer in 2017. Even with these contradictions, the songs kept shaping generations. In 2025, John said he worried that younger people might forget the Beatles and the ideals his parents stood for. He felt responsible for keeping that flame alive. He said his parents had given him so much that helping protect their legacy was the least he could do.